Hello, beautiful soul. Thank you so much for joining me again in the next video in the election stress series. It's been an interesting election for sure. I thought that the last election was intense, and I had gotten off of social media in the days before the election, and this time is even more intense. And so if anything that I share from my personal experience can help you, then that thrills me and makes this all worthwhile. What I'd like to talk about in this video is the idea of suffering. There is a massive spectrum of suffering. I don't begin to know what it's like for others. I do know that in my own way, I have suffered, and I am suffering in this election, more on a general humanity level, and then also on a personal level. It has affected my life in a personal way. And no one wants to suffer. Well, I shouldn't say that. There might be some that is a belief that suffering creates good things. And I'm not here to debate that. But I will say that for most of us, I would imagine that suffering is unpleasant and that we would rather not be suffering. And what you can do is, if you do feel like you're suffering, just evaluate how that's feeling, and evaluate if you feel like it's having a negative impact on your mental and emotional health and your physical health. And then determine whether or not that's something that you want to have in your life. So if you do feel like you are suffering, or maybe those around you are suffering, and you want to understand it a little more, and you would like it to be different, then you can listen to the video and maybe gain some understanding. The thing about suffering, and Don Miguel Ruiz talks about it in his book, The Fifth Agreement. You may be familiar with his book, The Four Agreements. He also has a book called The Fifth Agreement. And in that book, he shared a concept which really blew my mind, and gave me a lot of understanding about suffering and about what we as humans do in a reaction to suffering. So for the sake of this discussion, we'll assume that suffering is bad and that people in general don't want to be suffering, don't want to feel those feelings and be in a space of suffering. So what happens is a very instinctual and primal and unconscious response to suffering. We don't want to feel the feelings. They feel unpleasant. They feel out of control. They feel desperate. They feel painful, uncomfortable. Whatever range and level of suffering you have, our natural response to suffering is that we don't want to feel it anymore. So we will push it out, try to push it out of our bodies and push it onto somebody else, onto someone else. That most often happens to be the people that are closest to you in your life. Your significant other, your children, or your parents, or your close friends. I was one of those people that was a sponge and I wanted everyone to be okay. I was the peacemaker. So what would happen is if my husband wasn't feeling uncomfortable or a certain level of suffering, or my children were, they would naturally, as Don Miguel Ruiz says, they would find any way that they could push it off of themselves and put it onto someone else. And I would take it because I was empathic and I wanted peace and I wanted everyone to be okay. So I would be a sponge and I would suck all of the suffering into myself. And that would unload the person. They would project that suffering onto me. I, by observation, feel like that is happening right now. There's a lot of unrest and upset and suffering, and I'm not talking about physical suffering out in the world of violence and that type of thing. What I'm talking about in this conversation, in this series, is emotional suffering. So if you find yourself in a place where you are physically suffering or in danger, I'm not speaking to that because I don't have personal experience with that. So this is if you are suffering emotionally and existentially. If you are feeling that way, you may be searching for someone, an individual, or a group of people to push it onto, to blame for your suffering, to make yourself feel better. And I am not saying that it's not okay to do that. I am asking right now in these videos if that is causing you to deplete or degrade your mental health, your emotional stability, then I'm giving you an opportunity to explore that concept with me, that we can have a tendency, if we are suffering, to push it out from ourselves and to put it onto an individual, to blame them for us feeling the way we're feeling, or a group, to blame them. And that's natural because, as Don Miguel Ruiz says, we don't want to feel it, and so we will push it out and find a target so that we don't have to feel it. So I want you just to think about that, and if that's your tendency, and if you do push it onto somebody and blame someone else, then you're actually not in integrity and in taking responsibility for your own self. You're once again giving your power to someone else, and you're saying, I'm suffering because of you, so you need to be different so that I can feel better. What I'm saying is, we all suffer, and most of us don't want to feel the suffering, so we're pushing it out. So just be aware when you're doing that and when you're pushing it out, and be aware of how that feels when you are blaming someone else for your suffering. And if that works for you, then great. And if it's causing you stress and upset, and it's taking an emotional toll on you, then I would refer you back to the previous video that says that if you need someone to be different for you to feel better, then you are giving your power away. And you are at the mercy of that other person. And so the same thing applies here. If you are suffering and you push it onto somebody else and you blame them for your suffering, a person or a group, then you are giving them the power. And then the only way your suffering will end is if they start to behave differently. And so that's not going to work. Just logically. that is not going to work, because most likely that person is not going to be different than they are, because they are them. They are a unique individual, or they are a group that identifies very strongly with a particular thing. Otherwise, there wouldn't be that group. So just be aware when you feel you're in a space of suffering, what do you do with that suffering? And then when you do that thing, how does that feel? Just be aware and be the observer of that process. When I'm suffering, I push it on to someone else. And we all do it. It's human. It is human nature. When we feel bad, we don't want to feel bad. So we try to get rid of it. And oftentimes that is by pushing it onto someone else and blaming someone else. So just think about that today, and hopefully that's helpful for you. And I do want to say that I honor you, and if you are suffering, I'm sorry. And I hope that these videos can help to alleviate that a little bit. And I will see you in the next video.